The letter had taken 3 weeks to reach her. By the time Clara Whitmore read it, she was sitting at the edge of a narrow bed in a boarding house in Decatur, Illinois, with $42 to her name, a pair of shoes with a split sole she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months, and a hollow feeling in her chest that had stopped surprising her years ago. The envelope had been forwarded twice, once from her cousin Ruth's address in Springfield, once from the church hall where she'd been helping with mending work until the Reverend's wife decided she wasn't the right kind of help. Clara hadn't asked what kind of wrong she was. She already knew the general shape of the answer. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and set it on her knee and looked at the wall. Seeking a capable woman of good character to assist in the management of a household and the care of 3 children, ages 12, 6, and 4. The work is demanding. The ranch is remote. I will not deceive you about the difficulty. Room, board, and fair wage provided. Respond to Gideon Mercer, Millhaven, Colorado Territory. No mention of a wife, no mention of himself beyond the name. 3 children, which told her enough. Clara was 31 years old. She had been engaged once to a man named Douglas Farwell, who had broken the engagement 8 days before the wedding with a note delivered by his younger brother. The note had said simply that he didn't think they were suited. She had later learned from Ruth that Douglas had married a girl from Peoria 6 months afterward, a girl with money and a laughing disposition and a father who owned a mill. Clara had neither money nor, by that point, much of a laughing disposition. She had a plain face, a capable pair of hands, a habit of saying what she thought when she probably should have stayed quiet, and a reputation in 3 counties as a woman who, for reasons no one could quite put a finger on, nobody wanted. She had tried. That was the part nobody gave her credit for. She had kept house for her aunt for 2 years after her parents died. She had worked in a dry goods store. She had taken in mending. She had answered 3 other advertisements for domestic work and had the job each time until, in each case, something went sideways. A misunderstanding, a complaint from a neighbor, once a flat accusation of impropriety from a woman whose husband had done nothing more scandalous than ask Clara to pass the salt. Each time she had packed her things and moved on and told herself it didn't matter. It mattered. She picked up the letter again. The ranch is remote. She looked at the wall some more. Then she found a piece of paper and wrote back. The stagecoach to Millhaven took 4 days, with 2 overnight stops at way stations that smelled of horse and old straw. Clara sat with her bag on her lap for most of the journey because the strap on the overhead rack had broken, and the driver had told her, with no particular apology, that it wasn't his problem. She shared the coach with a hardware salesman who slept with his mouth open and a young couple traveling to meet the wife's family who spent most of the trip talking to each other in low voices and occasionally looking at Clara with the polite, slightly uncomfortable expression that people wore when they didn't know what to say to a woman traveling alone. She arrived in Millhaven on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The town was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. A main street with a general store, a livery, a post office operating out of what appeared to be someone's front room, 2 saloons, and a handful of other establishments. Mountains in the distance, still capped with last winter's snow even this late in the year. The air was sharp and dry and smelled like pine and something she couldn't name. She climbed down from the coach and stood on the packed dirt street with her bag and looked around. 3 women were standing on the porch of the general store. They stopped talking when she got off the stage. Clara had gotten used to that. She found the livery owner, a man named Pruitt, who told her that the Mercer Ranch was 8 miles south, and that if she wanted, she could wait for Gideon Mercer himself, who came into town most Fridays for supplies. Or I could hire a horse, Clara said. Pruitt looked at her bag, then at her shoes. It's 8 miles. I'm aware. He rented her a horse without further comment. She wasn't a strong rider, but she was adequate, which was enough for 8 miles of flat and rolling land, though the last 2 miles involved a creek crossing that got her skirt wet to the knee and a stretch of road that was more suggestion than fact. She arrived at the ranch house as the sun was getting low enough to make everything gold and shadow. The house was not what she had pictured. She'd pictured something run down but serviceable. What she found was a place that had clearly been well built once, solid timber frame, good proportions, a covered porch, but was somewhere deep in the process of being slowly abandoned from the inside out. 2 window shutters hung at wrong angles. A section of porch rail had collapsed and been propped rather than fixed. The kitchen garden to the side of the house was so overgrown with weeds you could barely see what had ever been planted there. Laundry hung on a line that sagged so badly the lower items dragged in the dust. A girl of about 12 was sitting on the porch steps. She had brown hair pulled back in a braid that was mostly escaped, and a look on her face that reminded Clara, sharply and without warning, of herself at 12. Watchful, waiting to be disappointed, already halfway to doing whatever was necessary to prevent it. The girl looked at Clara on the horse. She didn't say anything. "I'm looking for Gideon Mercer," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I wrote to him about the position." "I know who you are," the girl said. "He got your letter. Is he here?" "He's in the barn." Clara dismounted, tied the horse to the porch rail that wasn't broken, and waited. The girl watched her with those careful eyes. "What's your name?" Clara asked. A pause, like the question needed inspecting before she'd answer it. "Sadie." "How old are you, Sadie?" 12. "Do you go to school?" Another pause. "Sometimes." Clara didn't push further. She looked at the laundry on the line. She looked at the overgrown garden. She looked at the house and thought about what it had cost whoever built it and what it was costing now just to stand. Gideon Mercer came out of the barn. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and looked like a man who had been physically strong his entire life and was currently in the process of wearing down. His face was weathered past what his age probably was, Clara guessed late 30s, with dark stubble and eyes that were a gray-blue color that might have been striking in another context, but right now were mostly tired. He walked with purpose, but without energy, if that was possible, which apparently it was. He looked at her horse. He looked at her. He looked at her wet skirt. "You rode out," he said. "The livery rented me a horse. I was going to come get you tomorrow." "I didn't know that." He seemed to absorb this without judgment. "You're Miss Whitmore." "I am." He came up onto the porch, and they stood there for a moment with Sadie watching and the light going gold around everything. And Clara thought, this is the moment where it goes wrong. She had learned to anticipate it, the slight shift in someone's expression when they looked at her properly and recalculated. The kindly worded realization that she wasn't quite what they'd had in mind. "Come inside," Gideon said. "I'll put on coffee." Okay. The kitchen was worse than the outside had suggested. It wasn't dirty, exactly, but it had the feeling of a place being maintained by someone who didn't have enough time or attention for maintenance. Everything functional, nothing comfortable, every surface bearing evidence of half-finished tasks. A basket of mending that had been started and abandoned. A pot on the stove that had been washed but left upside down on the counter for what looked like days. A crack in the plaster near the window that had been patched with something that was already peeling. Gideon made coffee. Clara sat at the kitchen table. Sadie stood in the doorway. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of small feet. "That'll be Eli and Molly," Gideon said with his back to her. "Eli's 6. Molly just turned 4 in August." He paused. "She has bad dreams sometimes. I mention it so you're not caught off guard." "All right," Clara said. He set down 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. Up close, the tiredness in his face was more specific than just exhaustion. It was the particular kind that came from carrying something you couldn't put down. She recognized it, though hers had a different shape. "Your letter was honest," he said. "I appreciated that. I didn't see the point in being otherwise. Some women who answered weren't." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "They wrote what they thought I wanted to hear. I could tell." Clara didn't say anything. She drank the coffee, which was too strong, but she wasn't going to mention it. "My wife died 14 months ago," Gideon said. "Fever. It came fast. She was sick less than 2 weeks." He said it in the flat way people talked about the worst thing that had ever happened to them when they'd had enough time to stop being undone by it and not quite enough time to stop being hollowed out by it. The children took it hard, Sadie especially. She was the oldest, she understood the most. He stopped. "I've been managing, but managing isn't the same as—" He stopped again. "As what they need," Clara finished. He looked at her. "Yes." "I should tell you something," Clara said. She had thought about this on the 4-day stagecoach ride and on the 8 miles from Millhaven. She had gone back and forth about whether to say it or wait and let it come out on its own. But she had never been good at the alternative, at managing impressions and controlling the reveal, at being something other than what she was. It always backfired. She always ended up looking worse for having tried to look better. "I'm 31 years old," she said. "I've never been married. I have experience keeping house and I'm good with children, but I don't have a formal reference because my last position ended badly through no clear fault of either party. I'm capable of hard work, and I'm not going to quit when things get difficult. But I should be honest with you that I'm not—" She stopped, tried to find the right words. "I'm not what most people would consider obvious for this kind of position. I know that." Gideon looked at her steadily. "Why did your last position end badly?" "The wife of the household decided my presence was inappropriate. Her husband had done nothing wrong, neither had I. She decided anyway." "And before that?" "Similar, different details." A pause. He looked at his coffee. "My wife," he said slowly, "was talked about too, when we first came here. People had opinions about where we were from and how we'd gotten the money for the land." He looked back up at her. "I don't pay much attention to what people decide about each other before they've earned the right to an opinion." Clara hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. "Can you start Monday?" he said. No. She couldn't sleep that first night. Gideon had put her in a small room at the end of the upstairs hall, clean and spare, with a window that looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the house, the wind outside, the particular creaks of a timber-frame structure at night, and once, around 2 a.m, the sound of small footsteps in the hallway. She got up. Molly was standing in the hallway in a nightdress that was too small for her, holding something. Clara couldn't make it out in the dark. The little girl startled when the door opened. "Hey," Clara said softly. "It's all right. I'm Clara. I'm sleeping in this room. Are you all right?" Molly stared at her. She had her father's eyes, that gray-blue, but rounder, younger, not yet worn down to anything. Her hair was in 2 messy braids that had nearly fully unraveled. "I had a dream," Molly said. "Bad one?" Molly nodded. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" Molly looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the floor. Then she looked back up and said, "My mama used to sit with me." It landed like something physical. Clara kept her face still, which took effort. "I know," Clara said. "I know she did." "You're not her." "No, I'm not." "She's gone." "Yes." Molly looked down at the thing in her hands. Clara could see now that it was a small, worn cloth rabbit. One ear half detached, the stuffing gone flat with age and use. "Papa said she's not coming back." "That's right." "Is that true forever?" Clara crouched down so she was at Molly's level. The hallway was cold and she was in her night clothes and her knees were going to protest this position in about 30 seconds, but she stayed. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry. It's true forever." Molly considered this with the terrible seriousness of a 4-year-old confronting something she doesn't have the architecture to hold. Then she said quietly, "Can I sit by your door?" "You can come inside if you want. There's room." Molly came in and sat in the chair by the window and held her rabbit and looked at the mountains until she fell asleep, which took maybe 10 minutes. Clara put a blanket around her and went back to bed and lay awake for another hour, looking at the ceiling. I'm not her. She'd said it plainly, not softly. She hadn't promised anything except the truth, which was that she was there, and the other one wasn't. She wasn't sure if that was the right thing. She wasn't sure of very much, but at least it was honest, and honest was the only thing she was consistently capable of. Monday came. She started before dawn with the kitchen, a real cleaning, not the surface maintenance it had been getting, pulling everything out of the cabinets to wipe down the shelves, throwing out food that had gone stale and shouldn't have been kept that long in the first place, reorganizing what remained into something that actually made sense to work with. Gideon came in at 6:30 to find her on her knees scrubbing the base of the stove. He stopped in the doorway. "I found the issue with the bread," Clara said without turning around. "The sourdough starter was nearly dead. I fed it, it should recover, but if it doesn't, you'll want to get a new one from someone in town. Also, I moved the flour to a better container. The tin was letting moisture in." A pause. "All right," Gideon said. "Breakfast in 20 minutes, if that works." She heard him pull out a chair. Sadie came down at 7 with Eli in tow. A small, quiet boy with his mother's coloring, if she'd had to guess. Light brown hair and green eyes, who sat at the table and watched Clara with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned that new people are a potential source of disruption and is waiting to assess the magnitude. He didn't say good morning. He didn't say anything. "Good morning, Eli," Clara said, setting a plate in front of him. Eli looked at the plate, looked at her, looked back at the plate. "He doesn't talk much," Sadie said. Not unkindly, just stating it. "Since Mama." "That's all right," Clara said. "Neither do I, in the morning." This was not strictly true, but Eli seemed to accept it. He picked up his fork. It was not a warm scene of instant connection. Breakfast was quiet and a little awkward, and Sadie watched Clara with those careful eyes, and Eli ate without looking up, and Molly kept asking for more butter with a persistence that was the first thing Clara had noticed about her that seemed entirely normal for a 4-year-old. Gideon drank 2 cups of coffee and read over some kind of ledger he'd brought to the table, which Clara considered mildly rude but said nothing about. After breakfast, Gideon went back outside. Sadie disappeared somewhere, and Eli sat at the kitchen table and drew. He drew with total concentration. Whatever else was happening around him simply didn't register. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye while she worked. He was drawing horses. They were quite good, for 6. "Those are good," she said. Eli's pencil stopped. He looked at his paper. He didn't say anything, but he didn't move away either. "The proportions are right," Clara said. "That's the hard part usually. People draw horse heads too small." A very long pause, then, barely audible. "Mama said that." Clara's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. "She sounds like she knew about drawing," Clara said carefully. Eli looked at his paper for another moment. Then he started drawing again. The garden took 2 weeks. It wasn't glamorous work. It was digging out weeds that had roots like fists and turning soil that hadn't been properly turned in over a year and figuring out what could still be saved from what had been planted before everything fell apart. The answer was more than she'd expected. Underneath the neglect, there were carrots and beets still holding on, and a sprawling section of kale that apparently required no human intervention whatsoever to survive. Sadie watched her from the porch the first day. The second day she came closer, leaning on the fence. The third day she said, "You're doing it wrong." Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at her. "Mama had a different system," Sadie said. "She did the rows at an angle. She said it was better for drainage." "That's interesting," Clara said. "I've done it straight, but I'd be willing to try it her way. Can you show me how she laid it out?" The offer seemed to catch Sadie off balance. She had the look of someone who had been braced for an argument and didn't know what to do without one. "I remember mostly," she said slowly. "That'd help." Sadie came into the garden and showed her the angle of the rows, and Clara let her. Didn't ask questions about whether it was really better for drainage or push back when Sadie said firmly that the onions went in the northeast corner, not the northwest. It wasn't about the onions. Sadie needed to be the one who knew something, the one whose knowledge mattered. Clara understood that in a way that was almost physical, the way you understand things that have been true about yourself for a long time. After an hour of working side by side, Sadie said, without preamble, "The last one only stayed 6 days." Clara kept weeding. "What happened?" Eli threw a boot at her. "A boot?" She told him his drawing wasn't practical and he should do something useful. Sadie paused. He doesn't handle people being mean about the drawing." "Understandable," Clara said. "It's good drawing." Another pause. Then Sadie said, careful as everything else, "Are you going to stay?" Clara thought about $42 and a boarding house in Decatur, and a boarding house before that in Springfield, and the note from Douglas Farwell that she had never actually let herself finish reading all the way through. "I intend to," she said. "Intending and doing aren't the same." "You're right, they're not." Clara pulled a stubborn weed and threw it in the pile. "I can't promise you the future. Nobody can. But I'm not looking for a reason to leave if that's what you're asking." Sadie was quiet for a while. Then she started weeding again, not saying anything, which Clara was learning to read as a form of acceptance. In town, it was a different story. She'd gone in with Gideon on the 3rd Friday to handle supplies. He'd introduced her, briefly, to a few people. The store owner, Halverson, who had been polite. The postmaster, who hadn't been impolite. And two women, Margaret Hollis and Frances Crane, who were the kind of women Clara had been running into her entire adult life. They were not cruel, exactly. That would have required a kind of directness neither possessed. What they were was precisely calibrated in their politeness, warm enough not to be called cold, distant enough to make the temperature clear. Such a long way to come, Margaret had said, which was not quite a question and not quite a statement. A capable woman can always find work, Frances had added, which was meant to be a compliment but had the shape of an insult. In the street afterward, Gideon had said, "Pay them no mind." "I don't," Clara said, which was not quite true but close enough. Margaret Hollis has opinions about everything west of the Mississippi, most of them wrong. He was loading things into the wagon and didn't look at her. She told me I should send the children to her sister in Denver after Eleanor died. Said the ranch was no place for them without a woman to manage it. "What did you say?" A pause in the loading. "Nothing I'm going to repeat in polite company," Clara almost smiled. Fair enough. It wasn't the last time she'd encounter Margaret Hollis or Frances Crane. It wasn't the last time she'd catch women looking at her in a particular way in the general store or stop talking when she came too close. She knew what they saw. A woman past the age when women were supposed to be in someone's keeping arrived in a widower's household, without husband or reference, with a plain face and capable hands, and a reputation that had traveled, apparently, even here. She let it be what it was. She had other things to worry about. The hardest part was Eli. Sadie she could read, which made Sadie manageable. Molly was 4, and Molly's needs were concrete. She wanted butter, she wanted her rabbit, she wanted someone to sit with her when she had dreams, she wanted to be picked up occasionally, even though she was technically old enough not to need it. Clara could do all of those things. Eli was harder. He had mostly stopped speaking. Not entirely. He spoke to his father in short sentences and occasionally to Sadie when he needed something. But the general flow of words that a 6-year-old was supposed to have had dried up sometime in the past 14 months and hadn't come back. His teacher, Miss Alderman, had sent a note home saying he was falling behind and she was concerned, which Gideon had read and put on the stack of papers in the kitchen with the expression of a man who knew something was wrong and didn't know how to fix it. Clara read the note. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it. What she did was start leaving things on the kitchen table in the mornings before Eli came down. Not for him, ostensibly. Just there. A piece of paper with a rough sketch on it. A horse, badly drawn on purpose. One morning, a bird. One morning, just a set of circles that didn't mean anything. On the 4th morning, she came down to find that Eli had been at the table before her and had corrected her horse. The proportions were fixed. The legs were better. He'd left the paper and gone back upstairs. She left another bad drawing. He fixed it again. On the 6th morning, she came down to find him sitting at the table when she came in, with his own paper in front of him and her latest bad drawing beside it. He looked at her when she came in, looked at the drawing. "The neck is wrong," he said. His voice was rusty from disuse. "I know," Clara said. "I can never get necks right." "It's because you start at the head," he said. "You have to start lower." "Can you show me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pencil and showed her. Amatam. Gideon watched all of this. Clara was aware of it without making a point of it. He was not an intrusive watcher, didn't hover or check in unnecessarily, but he was paying attention the way a man paid attention when things he'd given up on started showing signs of life again. She'd catch him sometimes in the doorway of the kitchen or the barn, just watching, and he'd look away when she noticed, and neither of them mentioned it. One night in October, after the children were in bed, she found him on the porch. She'd come out to get the last of the laundry before the temperature dropped too far, and he was sitting on the remaining intact section of the porch rail, which Clara privately considered inadvisable given its structural state, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. She collected the laundry. "Sadie told me," Gideon said, "that she showed you Eleanor's way of doing the garden rows." Clara paused in folding. "She did." "She doesn't talk about Eleanor much. Not to me." He said it without obvious grief. It was past the obvious stage. "I think she doesn't want me to be sad." "Probably. And Eli." He stopped. "He talked at dinner tonight. Actually talked. About a horse he wants to draw. About the musculature of it. He said musculature with a slight, wondering emphasis, like the word in his 6-year-old's mouth was still improbable. He looked it up, in the almanac. He's smart, Clara said. He just needed a different... She stopped, not sure how to finish it. A different way in, Gideon said. Something like that. A pause. The night out here was very large. That was something she was still adjusting to, the scale of darkness in a place without much artificial light, the way the sky went on until it was overwhelming. In Decatur, there were street lamps. Here, there was just stars. I'm not going to ask you personal questions, Gideon said, but I want to say something. Clara waited. Whatever brought you here, whatever made you answer that advertisement, I'm glad you did. He looked at his cold coffee. You didn't have to be honest in your letter. You could have made yourself sound like something easier, and I would never have known the difference until you got here. But you didn't do that. It would have come out anyway, Clara said. Maybe, but a lot of people decide it's worth trying to slip something past and worry about it when it comes out. He looked at the mountains. I appreciate that you didn't. Clara folded the last piece of laundry. She stood for a moment in the cold air with the pile of clean clothes. You didn't have to hire me either, she said. Given what I told you, a lot of men wouldn't have. I'm not a lot of men, Gideon said. No, Clara said. I'm starting to see that. She went inside. She put the laundry away. She went to bed and lay in the narrow room and listened to the sounds of the house, which were starting to sound familiar now. The particular creak of the third step, the way the front door settled in its frame at night, the sound Molly made in her sleep when she was dreaming, and whether it was going to develop into the kind that needed someone there. She lay there and thought about what it meant to intend something versus what it meant to do it. Sadie had been right that they weren't the same, but she was here. She had done the thing she intended. She was still doing it. That was she was finding, often enough. By the end of October, the garden was producing again. The kitchen ran on a schedule that didn't require Gideon to think about it. The laundry line had been properly rehung, and the porch rail had been added to a list of repairs that Clara had made and posted on the kitchen wall, organized by urgency, which Gideon had looked at for a long time and then started working through from the top. Molly had started calling her Miss Clara. Eli had started sitting across from her at the kitchen table after school, not quite talking, but present in a way he hadn't been before. Sadie had shown her the locations of every tool on the ranch and which ones needed sharpening and where Eleanor had kept the good scissors, which information she delivered with the brisk efficiency of someone passing on essential institutional knowledge. It wasn't a healed household. Clara didn't have illusions about that. The grief was still there, present in the way it was present in places where someone had been. In the worn patch on the kitchen floor, where a woman with a particular walking pattern had stood for years. In the books on the shelf with another woman's name written inside the covers. In the way Gideon sometimes stopped mid-sentence and looked at something for a second too long before coming back. But it was something. It was a household with dinner on the table and laundry on a line that didn't drag in the dirt, and a 6-year-old who had started using the word musculature, and a 4-year-old who slept through the night more often than not. And Clara, for the first time in a long time, got up in the morning knowing what she was going to do. That was not nothing. She was slowly beginning to understand quite a lot. What she hadn't understood in those early weeks was that Millhaven was watching, not in the way it watched everything, the mild, ambient watching of a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business by default. This was something more focused, something more specific. Margaret Hollis had opinions, and Margaret Hollis had friends. And Margaret Hollis had noticed that the woman Gideon Mercer had hired was still there 2 months on, and was apparently making herself quite at home, and seemed to be on comfortable terms with Gideon Mercer in ways that Margaret Hollis found, upon reflection, worth discussing. Clara didn't know this yet. She would know it soon enough. But in those last days of October, with the garden put to bed for winter and the kitchen running right, and Eli asleep upstairs with a new drawing of horse musculature tacked above his bed, she didn't know it. She sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to sleep and mended a pair of Molly's socks and thought about nothing in particular. The house settled around her. Outside, the mountains were dark against a sky full of stars. For the first time in a long time, Clara Whitmore was exactly where she had chosen to be. The socks she'd been mending that night had a third hole she hadn't noticed in the lamplight, which she found the next morning in better light, and which required starting over on the heel entirely. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that accumulated. The list on the kitchen wall kept growing even as Gideon worked through it from the top, because a ranch that had been running on grief and inertia for 14 months didn't surrender its disrepair quickly or all at once. It gave it up in pieces, grudgingly, the way a person unlearned a bad habit, with backsliding, with the occasional morning when everything that had been fixed seemed to have broken again overnight. November came in cold and fast. The first snow hit on a Tuesday, which Clara knew because Molly woke her at 5 in the morning by standing at her bedroom door saying, "It's white," with an urgency that suggested the world had ended and been replaced with something better. Clara got up and stood at the window with Molly on her hip. The child had taken to being carried again since the nights had gotten colder, which Clara suspected was at least as much about warmth as anything else. And they looked at the ranch in the early gray light with an inch of snow over everything. "It's cold," Molly observed. "Very. Will the horses be cold?" "Your papa put extra bedding in the barn last week. They'll be fine." Molly considered this. Then, "Will you be cold?" "Not if I make coffee," Clara said. This logic seemed satisfactory. Molly allowed herself to be put down and followed Clara to the kitchen, where Clara started the stove and Molly sat at the table with her rabbit and watched with the particular focused attention she gave to things she found important, which included coffee making, bread rising, and the movements of the cat that lived in the barn and occasionally came to the kitchen door. By the time Gideon came in from the early chores, Clara had coffee and oatmeal going, and Molly had fallen back asleep sitting up at the table with her head on her rabbit, which Gideon saw and stopped in the doorway for a moment before coming in quietly. "She wake you?" he said, low. "Around 5. Clara kept her voice down. "She wanted to see the snow." Gideon looked at his youngest daughter asleep at the kitchen table. Something moved through his expression. Not the grief exactly, more like the edge of it, the place where grief and ordinary life ran up against each other without resolving. "Eleanor used to do that," he said. "Wake them up for the first snow." Clara didn't respond to that directly. She set a cup of coffee in front of the chair he usually sat in and went back to the oatmeal. "It's a good thing to do," she said, after a moment. Gideon sat down. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Outside, the snow kept coming, light and dry, the kind that accumulated fast. The ledger problem surfaced that same week. Clara had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the receipt from the hardware supplier in Millhaven because Gideon had mentioned that something had been ordered and not delivered, and she wanted to find the paperwork. What she found in the process was 3 months of accounts that didn't quite add up. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested catastrophe, but in the particular incremental way of a ranch that was spending slightly more than it was making and had been doing so long enough that the gap had become meaningful. She sat with the ledger for a while. Then she closed it and put it back where she'd found it. She thought about it for 2 days. She turned it over and looked at it from different angles, which was how she dealt with things she didn't know what to do with. The question was whether to mention it. She had no formal standing to mention it. She was hired help, not a partner, not family. Gideon had not asked for her opinion on the finances. He had not, as far as she knew, asked for her opinion on anything except where she wanted to sleep and whether the wage he was offering was acceptable. On the 3rd day, she said, "I was looking for the hardware receipt and I saw the accounts." Gideon was at the kitchen table eating breakfast. He set his fork down, slowly, and looked at her. "And?" he said. "I'm not trying to stick my nose in," Clara said, "but you've got a gap between the cattle income and the operating costs that's been sitting there since about June. If the spring calf count doesn't come in high, it's going to be a problem by summer." A long pause. Gideon looked at his plate. He had the look of a man who knew something and had been hoping, not entirely rationally, that not looking at it directly might cause it to resolve on its own. "I know about the gap," he said. "All right." Eleanor managed most of the accounts after she... He stopped. "I've been keeping up with it, but I'm not as careful as she was." "The Harper outfit has been underpaying on the grazing lease," Clara said. "It's in the contract at $14 a month per section, and they've been paying $11 since August. That's not nothing over 6 months." Gideon looked at her. "How do you know what's in the contract?" "I found it with the receipts. I wasn't snooping. It was right there." She paused. "You could write to Harper and ask about it. or go talk to him directly. Either way, it's $36 sitting there that you're owed." The silence stretched. Clara waited it out, which was something she had learned, when to push and when to let a man come to something in his own time. "I'll go see Harper," Gideon said finally. "This week." "Good." She sat down across from him, which was something she'd started doing at meals. Not formally, not pretending she was family, but because eating standing at the counter was impractical and the kitchen table had room. Gideon had never commented on it. "I can help with the accounts," she said, "if you want. I kept the books at the dry goods store in Springfield for 2 years. I'm not an accountant, but I'm careful." Gideon looked at her for a moment that went slightly longer than ordinary. "You kept books, among other things. You didn't mention that. You didn't ask about accounts. You asked about children and housekeeping." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite, but something in that direction, a brief loosening of the usual tightness around his mouth. "Fair point," he said. "Think about it," Clara said. "I'm not pushing." She wasn't. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the snow-covered yard and didn't push. And Gideon ate the rest of his breakfast without saying anything, and that was sufficient. He left the ledger on the table the next morning with a note that said simply, "If you have time." It was Eli who told her about the school situation. He didn't tell her directly. That wasn't how Eli communicated about difficult things. What happened was that she found him one Thursday afternoon, a school day, sitting in the barn with his sketchbook instead of being where he was supposed to be, which was Miss Alderman's classroom in town. "You're meant to be at school," Clara said. Eli looked at his drawing. It was a very good drawing. He was working on a series of horses in motion, galloping sequences, and had been using a method she didn't recognize where he sketched the movement lines first before adding the form. She didn't know where he'd learned that. She suspected he'd invented it. "Eli." "I know," he said. "What happened?" A long pause. He turned a page in the sketchbook and didn't turn it back. "Thomas Briggs said my drawing was stupid, and Miss Alderman said I had to put it away during lessons, and Thomas Briggs said it was stupid again at lunch." "What did you do?" "I hit him." Clara looked at him. "I know," he said, again, smaller. "With what?" A slight pause. "My lunchbox." "Did you hurt him?" "Not very much." He glanced up at her briefly. "He's bigger than me." Clara sat down on a hay bale. This was not the moment for the obvious lecture. Eli knew he'd done wrong. She could hear it in his voice, the particular flatness of a child who has already completed the internal prosecution and is waiting for the sentencing portion. What he needed was not more of the same. "The drawing isn't stupid," she said. "That's true, and Thomas Briggs is wrong about it." Eli looked at his sketchbook. "But," Clara continued, "hitting people with your lunchbox is going to keep getting you in trouble, regardless of whether they're wrong. Because the thing people remember is the hitting. They don't remember what started it." "It's not fair," Eli said. It wasn't a whine. It was a statement of observable fact, delivered with the flat conviction of a 6-year-old who had already figured out that the world didn't run on fairness. "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." Eli looked at her. He'd been expecting she could tell some version of "you still have to behave," or "two wrongs don't make a right," the usual adult construction that treated the emotional content of the situation as something to be smoothed over rather than acknowledged. "How do I make him stop?" Eli asked. "Harder question," Clara said. "Let me think about it." She thought about it that evening after the children were in bed, and what she came up with wasn't elegant or particularly satisfying, but it was honest. Some people stopped when you stopped reacting, and some people stopped when you got better at the thing they mocked, and some people never stopped, and you learned to care less. She told Eli this the next morning at breakfast, while Gideon was still outside, in plain language, without promising that any of it would definitely work. Eli ate his oatmeal and thought about it. Then he said, "What if I make my drawing really good, like better than anyone?" "Then Thomas Briggs can say it's stupid all he wants, and it won't be true," Clara said. Eli nodded slowly. "Okay." He went to school. He didn't hit anyone with his lunchbox, as far as Clara knew, for the remainder of the month. Good. What was growing between her and Gideon? She didn't have a name for it, and she wasn't interested in naming it, because names made things into things, and she was not in a position to have anything that was a thing. It was small. It was the kind of thing she could have explained away if she'd wanted to. The conversations that ran longer than necessary after the children were in bed. The way he'd started bringing her coffee in the mornings when she was already working instead of waiting for her to pour her own. The night he'd spent 2 hours fixing the shutters she'd added to the repair list, even though the shutters were low priority and there were higher priority items on the list still waiting. She did not ask him about the shutters. He did not explain them. She was not romantic about it. She had been once, had spent years being quietly romantic about things that then didn't happen or happened wrong, had built elaborate internal architectures of possibility, and then watched them come down. She was not going to do that here. She was employed on this ranch. She was useful here. She had 3 children who were beginning to trust her in ways she wasn't going to undermine by turning it into something she wanted for herself. But she was also 31 years old and not a stone. And Gideon Mercer on a good day, when the tiredness lifted a little and he was talking about something he knew well, cattle or land or the particular mechanics of the water system he'd built for the ranch, was not a man you could be entirely indifferent to if you were paying any attention at all. She paid as little attention as she could manage, which was imperfect. One evening in late November, he came in from mending a fence line with a cut on his left hand that he was pressing a dirty cloth against in a way that suggested he thought it was minor, and it wasn't. Clara saw it when he came in the kitchen door and took the cloth away without asking permission and looked at the cut, which was deep enough to need proper cleaning and probably a few stitches if they'd been close to a doctor, which they weren't. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine." "Sit down, Gideon." He sat. She got the things she needed, clean cloth, carbolic, the good needle and thread she'd been saving, and he sat at the kitchen table and watched her work with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "When did you learn to do this?" he said. "My father had a farm. Things happened." She cleaned the cut with the carbolic, which made him exhale sharply through his nose but not say anything, which she appreciated. "We weren't near a doctor either. Did it often happen?" "Often enough." She threaded the needle. "Hold still." "Clara." She looked up. He was looking at her with something direct in his expression, something that cut through the usual careful distance. She'd gotten used to the careful distance. She wasn't sure what to do with the lack of it. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I know I said it before, but I want to say it again, properly. What you've done with the children?" He stopped. "Eli laughed at dinner last week. Really laughed. I hadn't heard that in I don't know how long." Clara went back to the needle. "He's a funny kid when he relaxes." "He's a kid again," Gideon said. "He stopped being a kid when Eleanor died. He went somewhere I couldn't reach." She made the first stitch. He stayed still. "Sadie told me something yesterday," Gideon said. "What did she say?" "She said you were the first adult who'd ever told her that her garden rose idea might actually be better than the standard way, that you'd been doing them her way all autumn." "I have been," Clara said. "She was right about the drainage." "That's not the point." "I know." She made the second stitch. She needed to be right about something. A pause. "Yes," Gideon said. She did. She finished the stitching and bound the hand properly and told him to keep it dry for at least a week, which he accepted without argument, and then they sat at the kitchen table for a while after that and talked. About the ranch, about the spring plans, about a book Eli had taken out of the small lending library at the general store that had horse anatomy illustrations and had apparently changed his life. They talked past when they usually would have stopped and gone to their respective ends of the house, and Clara didn't note the time until the lamp started guttering. "Late," she said. "Yes." She got up to deal with the lamp. She was aware crossing the kitchen of him watching her and of what that awareness felt like, the particular warmth of it, which she was not going to name. "Good night, Gideon," she said. "Good night, Clara." December came. With December came the realization that the ranch was not going to have a straightforward winter. The Harper grazing issue had been resolved. Gideon had gone to see him, and Harper had paid the back amount without much argument, which Gideon reported with the slightly surprised air of a man who had expected a fight and not gotten one. The accounts were in better shape now that Clara was tracking them carefully, though not comfortable. 2 of the older cows were sick with something the veterinarian in Mill Haven couldn't diagnose with certainty, and 3 fence sections on the eastern pasture had come down in a windstorm and needed repairing before the cattle drifted. Gideon worked in the cold with the focus of a man who had been keeping a ranch running by willpower alone for over a year and was not going to stop now. Clara watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, the way he moved through the work, methodical and without complaint, doing things that needed doing without waiting for them to become crises. It was the same quality she recognized in herself, the thing that kept you functional when functional was all you could manage. She had started wondering, in a way she kept strictly contained, what it would be like to be useful to someone like that on a permanent basis, not as hired help, as something else. She did not follow that wondering anywhere. She turned away from the kitchen window and made bread and added a fence section to the repair list. It was Sadie who told her about Margaret Hollis. They were in the garden, what was left of the garden in December, which was mostly the turned earth and the cold frames Clara had built to try to keep the kale going through the worst of the winter. And Sadie was helping without being asked, which was one of the ways Clara measured the temperature of things. Sadie helped when she was comfortable. When she wasn't, she disappeared to her room. "Mrs. Hollis was talking about you in the store," Sadie said. Not accusatory, just reporting. "I heard her when Papa was getting the flour." Clara kept working. "What was she saying?" "That it's not right. A woman living on a ranch with a widower and no—" Sadie stopped. "I don't remember exactly what she said. Something about it not being proper." "What did your father say?" "He didn't hear her. She said it to Mrs. Crane, not to him." Sadie pulled a dead plant stalk out of the frost-hard ground and held it. "Is it true? That it's not proper?" Clara sat back on her heels and looked at Sadie. 12 years old, trying to figure out what the adult world was actually made of versus what it claimed to be made of, watching to see if Clara was going to tell her the truth or the comfortable version of it. "The accusation isn't really about property," Clara said. "It never is when it's directed at women. It's about whether a woman's presence is acceptable. And the people who decide that, some of them have decided no before they've even looked." Sadie thought about this. "Because you're not married. Because I'm not married, and because I'm here, and because some people don't like things they can't put in an easy category. What category would make it acceptable?" "Married to your father," Clara said flatly. "That's the only one that would satisfy them. And we're not." She paused. "Your papa hired me to work here. That's the entirety of what's happening, and anyone who says otherwise is filling in blanks that aren't there." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "Do you think they'll make trouble?" she asked. Clara had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since she'd come to understand in those first weeks that Margaret Hollis was not the kind of woman who talked and let it be talking. She'd seen the type before, in Springfield, in Decatur, in every place she'd been long enough to become legible to the people who needed to have an opinion about her. "Maybe," Clara said. "What would happen?" "I don't know yet." She picked up her trowel. "But we'll deal with it when it comes, not before." Sadie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the serious practicality she always carried. She went back to pulling dead stalks. They worked in the cold for another hour and didn't talk about it further, but the shape of it stayed in the air between them. The knowledge that something was coming, that the careful small world they'd been building on this ranch had been noticed by people who might not let it stand, and that the work of making it real enough to survive, that was still ongoing. Chat. 3 days before Christmas, Eli got into a fight at school that he did not start. This was the version Clara believed because Eli told it badly, with the particular halting, factual quality of someone who is telling the truth and doesn't know how to make it sound convincing, and because Miss Alderman's note, which arrived the next morning, described the situation in terms that were more careful than Clara expected, noting that several students had been involved and that Eli's response, while not appropriate, had been provoked. What had happened, as best Clara could piece together from Eli's version and the note, was that Thomas Briggs had taken Eli's sketchbook during lunch and shown it around in a way that was intended to be mocking, and had instead, inadvertently, probably to Thomas Briggs's significant annoyance, generated genuine admiration from a few other students, including, apparently, a girl named Lucy Whitfield who had said loudly that Eli's horses were better than anything she'd ever seen. Thomas Briggs had then said something about Eli and his dead mother that Clara was not going to repeat, even in her own head, and Eli had responded physically and it had taken two older students to separate them. She sat with Eli in the kitchen that afternoon, after school, while Gideon was still outside. "He said something about Mama," Eli said. He was looking at the table. "I know. I couldn't." His voice broke slightly and he stopped, pulled it back with the effortful control of a child who has been practicing not crying for a long time. "I know you said they remember the hitting." "Some situations are different," Clara said. Eli looked up at her. "There are things people say that are going to make you want to hit them," Clara said. "That will be true your whole life. The line it's not about whether they deserve it. It's about whether you can live with what happens after." She paused. "In this case, you're 6. What's going to happen is you'll have to apologize to Miss Alderman and you'll lose your lunch break for a week. That's manageable." "I'm not apologizing to Thomas Briggs." "I didn't say Thomas Briggs. Miss Alderman." Eli considered this. "Okay." "And when you're older," Clara said, "and someone says something like that, about someone you love, who's gone, you'll have to make your own decision. I can't make it for you. But I want you to know that whatever you feel when that happens is not wrong. The feeling is never wrong. What you do with it, that's where you have choices." Eli was very quiet for a moment. "Do you have people who are gone?" he asked. "Yes." "Does it still hurt?" Clara looked at him. The small, serious, gifted child who was asking the real question, the one underneath all the other questions, which was whether the pain had an edge or went on forever. "Yes," she said, "but it changes. It gets," she tried to find the right word, "smaller, not in a bad way. It gets to a size you can carry." Eli thought about that for a long time. Then he picked up his pencil and opened his sketchbook to a new page. "Can I draw while we talk?" he said. "Of course," Clara said. She sat across from him while he drew, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the first real Christmas cold was settling over the ranch, and they talked, in the way Eli talked, which was sideways, in pieces, circling the thing he wanted to say rather than going directly to it, about his mother, about what he remembered, about the way she'd smelled like something herbal and clean, about how she'd let him draw at the table the same way Clara did. She did not say I'm like her. She was not like Eleanor Mercer, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but she let him talk, and she listened with her whole attention, and when he finally ran out of words, she said nothing for a moment, and then said, "She sounds like someone worth remembering." "She is," Eli said, and then, You're also... He stopped, got stuck on whatever he was trying to say, looked at his drawing. "It's all right," Clara said. "You don't have to finish it." But she knew what he'd been trying to say, and she sat with the weight of it, the enormous, fragile, completely unexpected weight of it, all the way through the making of dinner and the eating of it and the putting of children to bed. And she was still sitting with it when she finally sat down alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low. Gideon came in from checking the animals. He looked at her sitting there in the quiet kitchen with whatever was showing on her face that she hadn't quite contained. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing bad," she said. "The opposite of bad." He stood for a moment, reading her the way he'd been quietly learning to read her over these weeks, and then he pulled out a chair and sat down and said, "Tell me." So she told him about Eli, about Thomas Briggs, about the conversation at the kitchen table. She told him plainly, without performance, and he listened the same way she'd listened to Eli, with his whole attention, not interrupting, not trying to fix anything. When she was done, Gideon sat with it for a moment. "He talked about Eleanor," Gideon said, "for almost an hour. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. When he looked up, his eyes were a little brighter than usual, which he was not going to acknowledge because that was his to have in private. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything." "You were there," Gideon said. "You stayed. That's..." He stopped, started again. "That's not nothing, Clara. That's what they needed. Someone who just stays." She looked at him. She had been trying, carefully and consistently, not to want things she was not positioned to want. She was still trying. She was doing a middling job of it. But sitting at that kitchen table in December with the cold outside and the lamp burning down and Gideon Mercer looking at her like she was someone worth looking at, it was harder than usual to maintain the necessary distance, and she was not entirely sure she managed it. "It's late," she said. "Yes," Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Clara got up and turned down the lamp, and Gideon said goodnight in a voice that was quieter than usual, and she went upstairs and stood at her window and looked out at the snow-covered ranch in the dark. She had come here with $42 and a shattered sense of herself, and nothing to offer except the willingness to stay. What she had now, this house, these children, this complicated, careful, grief-worn man, she wasn't sure what to call it. She wasn't sure it was hers to call anything, but she was here, she was still here, and in the deep cold of December, in the narrow room at the end of the hall, that felt like enough. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like it might be exactly enough. Christmas came and went quietly. There was no money for extravagance, and Clara hadn't expected any. What she'd done was spend 3 evenings in the week before making small things. A set of new sketching pencils for Eli, bought from the general store and wrapped in brown paper. A hair ribbon for Sadie and a green that matched her eyes. A stuffed cloth horse for Molly to keep her rabbit company, sewn from a piece of old flannel she'd found in the mending basket. She set them at the ends of the children's beds on Christmas Eve and didn't make a ceremony of it. Molly found the horse at 5 in the morning and brought it to Clara's room to show her. "He needs a name," Molly said, holding both the horse and the rabbit and looking at Clara with the specific urgency of a 4-year-old for whom naming was a matter of serious consequence. "What are you thinking?" Clara said. Molly looked at the horse. "Button," she said. "That's a good name." "Rabbit's name is Rabbit," Molly explained. "So Button goes with Rabbit." "That makes sense." Molly climbed onto the bed and sat next to Clara and arranged both animals carefully in her lap. Outside the window, it was still dark, and the ranch was very quiet under the snow. Molly didn't seem to want anything except to sit there, which Clara had learned was sometimes all children wanted. Not conversation, not entertainment, just the simple fact of someone present. They sat like that until the sky started lightening, and then Clara got up to start the stove. Gideon had gotten his children a sled, which he'd made himself from the pine boards in the barn over the past 3 weeks in the evenings, when he thought no one was paying attention. Clara had known about it for 2 weeks, but hadn't said anything. Sadie and Eli tested it on the slope behind the house after breakfast, with a competitive intensity that resulted in Eli face first in a snowdrift twice, and Sadie laughing at him, which was the least guarded Clara had ever seen Sadie. That particular open laugh, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched it, and felt something she couldn't quite hold steady. A fullness that was almost uncomfortable, like trying to fit more water into a jar than it was made for. Gideon came to stand beside her at the window. "She used to laugh like that before," he said. "Not for a while." "She's coming back," Clara said. "They all are." He looked at her sideways. "Mostly because of you." "Mostly because they're resilient kids," Clara said. "Don't do that," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Don't reduce what you did to almost nothing," he said. "It's not a small thing." She looked back at the window. Eli had retaliated with a snowball that caught Sadie square in the back of the head, and Sadie was now in pursuit with an armful of snow and no particular concern for her dignity. "All right," Clara said. It was the most she could say. She was still working on accepting things that were given directly, without conditions. January was brutal. The cold that came down off the mountains in the second week was the kind that made the air feel solid, that cracked the water in the troughs overnight, that drove the cattle into the south pasture where there was a natural windbreak and kept them there. Gideon was up before 4 every morning to check the animals, and often didn't come in until after dark. Clara kept the stove going and made food that would hold, stews, heavy bread, the kind of cooking that was about heat and sustenance rather than anything else. She moved the children's lessons to the kitchen table because it was the warmest room, so the mornings became a particular kind of managed chaos. Molly drawing on her slate, Eli working on the arithmetic he'd fallen behind on, Sadie reading aloud because she'd decided that was the best way to study, regardless of what anyone else was doing with the volume. Clara didn't mind. Noise had stopped feeling like disruption. It had started feeling like evidence of something. Miss Alderman sent home a note in the second week of January saying that Eli had shown significant improvement in his reading comprehension and that his arithmetic was nearly caught up. She also mentioned, at the bottom of the note in smaller handwriting that felt like an afterthought but probably wasn't, he drew a portrait of the class in the margins of his reading workbook. "I confiscated it, but I want you to know it was genuinely remarkable." Clara read the note to Gideon at dinner. Eli's ears went red. She confiscated it, Eli said. You drew it in your workbook, Gideon said. It was the right size. Eli, I'll draw her a new one, on proper paper. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at her stew. That would probably help your case, Gideon said finally. I know, Eli said, with the pragmatic tone of someone who had already arrived at this conclusion and was one step ahead. It was this kind of dinner, that particular looseness, that ease, that Clara had started to understand was not a small thing. It was the hardest thing. Grief had a way of making ordinary life feel indecent, like laughing at a funeral. Like going on was a kind of betrayal. Getting a family back to ordinary life, to dinner conversations about confiscated sketchbooks, was not incidental. It was everything. The knock on the door came on a Wednesday morning in late January. Gideon was in the south pasture. The children were at school. Clara was in the kitchen working through the week's accounts when she heard the knock and opened the door to find two men she didn't recognize, and standing slightly behind them, Margaret Hollis. The men were in town clothes, not ranch clothes. One of them carried a satchel. The other had a notebook already open. Miss Whitmore? Said the one with the satchel. He had a careful, neutral face, the kind of face people cultivated when their job involved delivering unpleasant news and not personally absorbing the reaction. My name is Arthur Cade. I'm a county welfare investigator from the office in Brentwood. This is my colleague, Mr. Foss. We've received a complaint regarding the welfare of the children residing at this property. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at them. Then she looked at Margaret Hollis, who was looking at the snow beside the porch. What kind of complaint? Clara said. We've received information that suggests the moral environment of this household may not be appropriate for the raising of minor children. Cade said it with the rehearsed evenness of someone delivering a prepared sentence. We're here to investigate. You better come in, Clara said. She stepped back from the door. She was cold. She'd opened the door in her indoor clothes and the January air was coming straight through. But the cold was useful. It kept her surface still. They came in. Margaret Hollis came in last and Clara closed the door, and they stood in the kitchen she'd spent 3 months putting in order. Where's Mr. Mercer? Cade said. Working. He'll be back. She looked at the notebook in Foss's hand. What specifically has been reported? Cade set his satchel on the table, without being invited to, which Clara noted, and opened it. He removed a document and set it in front of her. It was a formal complaint, signed and dated, alleging that a woman of uncertain moral character was living in an unmarried arrangement with the widower Gideon Mercer, that the children were being raised in conditions inconsistent with community standards, and requesting a county investigation into the possibility of removing the children to more suitable care. Clara read it. She read it all the way through, which took longer than the investigators seemed to expect, because she read carefully and didn't skip anything. Then she set it down. The woman of uncertain moral character, she said, is me. I'm the housekeeper, hired by Mr. Mercer to manage the household and care for his children, as advertised publicly and filled through written correspondence. I have my own room. I am a paid employee. We understand that's your position, Foss said, looking up from his notebook. It's not my position. It's the arrangement. Clara looked at him steadily. What exactly is the standard for unsuitable moral environment in the county's definition? Miss Whitmore, I'm asking a factual question. I'd like a factual answer. Cade cleared his throat. The county's concern is the nature of the relationship between an unmarried woman and a widower in a shared household, and the potential effect on the children. The potential effect, Clara said. What effect have you observed? We've only just arrived. Then you haven't observed any. She looked at Margaret Hollis, who was still not quite meeting her eyes. Mrs. Hollis, when did you last see these children? Margaret Hollis said nothing for a moment. Then, in town. Some weeks ago. How did they look to you? That's not, did they look neglected? Did they look unhappy? Did they look like children living in an unsuitable environment? Clara. Margaret Hollis finally looked at her directly. She had the expression of someone who had committed to a course of action and was now finding the execution uncomfortable. This isn't personal. It's a complaint that my presence harms 3 children I have spent 4 months caring for, Clara said. It is entirely personal. Margaret Hollis looked at her hands. Cade stepped in. We'll need to speak with Mr. Mercer. We'll also need to see the living arrangements, speak with the children if possible, and review any relevant— Fine, Clara said. Sit down. I'll make coffee. Gideon will be in by noon. Buzz. Gideon came in at 11:30. He saw the two men at his kitchen table and Margaret Hollis in the chair by the window, and Clara standing at the stove with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Something held very still and very tight, like a rope under load. Clara said, "County welfare investigators. They've received a complaint." She handed him the document. He read it standing up, in his coat, still cold from outside. His face as he read it went through several stages. Confusion first, then understanding, then a particular kind of quiet that Clara had learned was his version of controlled anger. He set the document on the table. He looked at Margaret Hollis. "Margaret," he said. Her name, just her name, with a flatness in it. Margaret Hollis looked at the table. "Gideon, it's not— Did you write this?" Several of us were concerned. Did you write this?" A pause. "I was the one who made the formal complaint, yes." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Cade. "What do you need?" Cade explained the process. They would need to examine the living situation, speak with the children, and make a determination about whether the household met county standards. If it did not, they had the authority to recommend removal to alternative care. In this case, apparently Margaret Hollis had also provided a letter from a family in Denver willing to take the children. "There's a family already arranged," Clara said from the stove. Her voice was perfectly level. Gideon looked at her. "Mrs. Hollis has been thorough," Clara said. The tone in her voice, controlled, precise, exactly at the edge of something, made Gideon go very still. "The children come home from school at 3:30, Gideon said to Cade. "You can speak with them then. I'll show you the house now." He showed them the house. Clara stayed in the kitchen and listened to the sound of footsteps moving through the rooms she'd put in order. The clean rooms, the properly heated rooms, the children's rooms with their books and drawings, and the evidence of children being adequately and carefully cared for. She stood at the stove and kept the coffee hot and did not let herself think too far ahead. Margaret Hollis stayed in the kitchen. After a silence that went on long enough to become a statement, Margaret said, "I want you to understand that I don't dislike you." "I know," Clara said. "This has nothing to do with whether you like me. The children need—" "The children," Clara said, turning from the stove, "are getting what they need. Eli is back in school and his teacher sends home notes about his improvement. Molly sleeps through the night. Sadie is 12 years old and she laughs again. What they need is exactly what they have. And you know that, and that's not what this is about." Margaret Hollis's mouth tightened. "What this is about," Clara said, "is that I am an unmarried woman in a situation that makes people uncomfortable, and comfortable people with time on their hands sometimes confuse discomfort with harm. The children are not harmed. You're uncomfortable. Those are different things." Margaret Hollis stood up. "You're a plain-spoken woman, Miss Whitmore." "I've been told," Clara said. "It is not always an asset." "It hasn't been," Clara agreed, "but I've stopped apologizing for it." Margaret left the kitchen. Clara turned back to the stove and put both hands flat on the counter and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the inside of her chest, which was not as steady as her voice had been. She was frightened. That was the plain truth of it. She could dress it up in something more composed, but she was frightened. Not for herself, not primarily, but for the children, for Eli, who had started drawing again, and Molly, who slept through the night, and Sadie, who laughed, and for the thing they had all been building here, slowly and imperfectly, which was starting to be something real, and which could be taken apart by two men with a satchel and a notebook, and a complaint signed by a woman with too much time. She was frightened, and she kept the coffee hot, and she waited. The children came home at 3:30. Sadie came through the door first and read the room immediately. She had the instinct for wrongness that oldest children developed, the radar that was always slightly on. She looked at the two strange men, and then at Clara, and then at Gideon, who was standing near the window. "What's happening?" she said. Gideon said, "These men are from the county. They want to ask you some questions. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say, but I'd like you to be honest." Sadie looked at the men. She looked at Clara. Her face settled into the watchful, waiting expression Clara knew. the one that was assessing the magnitude of potential disruption. About what? Sadie said. Sadie, about how things are here, Cade said, with a practiced warmth that was not entirely false but was definitely practiced. About your home. Eli had come in behind Sadie and was standing just inside the door with his school bag still on his back, reading the situation with those quiet, careful eyes. Molly was behind him, holding Button the horse. Sit down, Sadie said to her siblings, in the voice she used when she'd decided to take charge of something. They sat. She sat across from Cade with her hands folded on the table and the expression of someone prepared to conduct a negotiation. Go ahead, Sadie said. Cade asked questions. Careful, neutral, county official questions. Were they warm enough? Were they eating well? Was there anything that worried them? Did they feel safe? Eli answered in his short, direct way. Yes, yes, no, yes, not elaborating unless pushed. Molly looked at Cade with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 4-year-old and said, Miss Clara makes good bread. Does she? Cade said, with the pained smile of a man trying to conduct a welfare investigation and being offered baked goods as evidence. It's the best bread, Molly confirmed. Foss was writing things down. Clara watched him from across the kitchen and couldn't read his handwriting from that distance, which was frustrating. Then Cade looked at Sadie and said, How would you describe your home since Miss Whitmore arrived? Sadie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table, then at Clara, then back at the investigator. My mother died, Sadie said, a year ago, November. Before that, it was a good house. After, it was like someone had taken all the air out. Papa was there, but he was somewhere else. We were going through the days, but there wasn't. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place we were waiting in. Nobody said anything. Foss had stopped writing. Miss Clara came in October, Sadie continued. Her voice was level, but just barely. She fixed the garden. She sorted the accounts. She makes Eli draw in the morning, and he talks again. She sits with Molly at night when she has dreams. She told me that the way my mother did the garden rows was right, and she changed how she was doing it to match. She paused. She didn't have to do that. She didn't have to do any of it. Sadie, Clara started. I'm answering his question, Sadie said, with a firmness that was entirely her mother's, if Clara had to guess. Cade looked at his document. He looked at his colleague. Foss was looking at the table. Miss Mercer, Cade said, has anything ever happened in this household that made you feel that Miss Whitmore's presence was inappropriate or harmful? Sadie looked at him with an expression that would have been withering on someone 3 times her age. No, she said. The opposite. After the investigators had finished and said they would be in touch with their assessment, and after Margaret Hollis had left without meeting anyone's eyes, Gideon closed the front door and stood with his hand on it for a moment. The children were still at the kitchen table. Clara was at the stove. Will they take us away? Eli said. Gideon turned from the door. No. Are you sure? A pause that was 1 second too long. I'm going to make sure of it, Gideon said, which was a different answer, and Eli heard the difference because Eli heard everything. How? Eli said. Gideon looked at Clara. She had her back to them, standing at the stove, and she was very still. I need to think, Gideon said. Come eat dinner. They ate dinner. It was quieter than usual, not the comfortable quiet they'd built up over months, but a tighter silence, the kind that lived over something unresolved. Molly kept looking at the door as if expecting the men to come back. Sadie ate with her jaw set. Eli finished his food and then sat drawing with a focus that was clearly less about drawing and more about having something to do with his hands. After the children were in bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the document. She'd read it twice already. She read it again. Gideon sat across from her. The complaint cites a letter from someone in Denver, Clara said. A family willing to take the children. I know. It cites 3 individuals in Millhaven who signed as supporting witnesses. She set the document down. This wasn't just Margaret Hollis. She organized it. Yes. The county investigation itself might come to nothing, Clara said. What we showed them today, Sadie's testimony, the house, the accounts, it should be enough. They're not going to find evidence of harm because there isn't any. But, Gideon said, But if they decide to push this to a formal hearing, it gets harder. At a formal hearing, public opinion matters. And public opinion in Millhaven right now isn't in our favor. Gideon's voice was flat. I don't know how far it isn't, Clara said carefully. What are you saying? She looked at him across the table. She had been sitting with the shape of what she was going to say for the past 4 hours, turning it over, finding the words for it that were honest without being cruel. I should consider leaving, she said. The silence that followed was very complete. No, Gideon said. Gideon, no. If I leave, the complaint loses most of its basis. The children stay where they are. The situation becomes, the children lose the person who has been keeping this family together for 4 months, Gideon said. His voice had an edge in it she'd never heard before. Not anger exactly, something harder. Is that the better outcome? The alternative might be that a county hearing decides the outcome, Clara said. In which case we might not get a choice. Then we fight it in a hearing. She looked at him. Gideon, I don't have standing in a public hearing. I'm hired help. I'm an unmarried woman with a history of positions that ended. You're the woman who saved my children, Gideon said. That's your standing. That's not how it works. I'll make it how it works. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Be practical, please. I'm trying to be practical. I'm being practical, he said. Practically speaking, I am not letting those men or Margaret Hollis or anyone else in this county decide who belongs in my house and who doesn't. Practically speaking, you belong here. The last sentence landed differently than the ones before it. He seemed to realize it a moment after he said it, and something shifted in his face. Clara looked at the table. That's not, he started. I know what you meant, she said. A pause. What did I mean? He said quietly. She looked up. He was watching her with the direct, unguarded look he'd had that night she'd stitched his hand, the one that cut through the careful distance. She had looked away from it then. She had been good at looking away from it. She held it this time. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know what you meant, and I don't think this is the moment to find out. He looked at her for a long moment. The hearing, he said finally. If it comes to that, will you stay for it? She thought about $42 and a boarding house in Decatur. She thought about the note from Douglas Farwell that she'd never finished reading. She thought about Molly at 5 a.m. with Button the horse, and Eli's rusty voice saying the neck is wrong, and Sadie showing her the angle of the garden rose with her mother's precision. I'll stay, Clara said. The county's letter arrived 10 days later. It said that the initial investigation had not found evidence of immediate harm, but that given the nature of the complaint and the community concern, a formal review hearing had been scheduled for the 12th of February at the Millhaven Community Hall. Both parties would have the opportunity to speak. Community members could offer testimony. Clara read the letters. Then she set it on the stack with the accounts, because there was no point in having a separate stack. 2 weeks, Gideon said. 2 weeks, she agreed. Sadie had come in while they were reading it, because Sadie was 12 and had excellent instincts and had been alert to the mail since the investigator's visit. She read the letter over Clara's shoulder without asking permission. We're going to the hearing? Sadie said. Yes, Gideon said. All of us? If you want to come. Sadie stood very straight. I testified to the investigators. I can testify at the hearing. Sadie, I know what I want to say. She looked at Clara. I have things to say that matter. Clara looked at this 12-year-old girl with her mother's garden rose in her watchful eyes and the laugh she'd gotten back and thought, yes, you do. We'll see, Clara said, which was the most she could offer, because she wasn't sure what a hearing would look like or what it would ask of any of them. But Sadie read that as the non-refusal it was, and nodded and went back to the garden, where she'd been checking the cold frames in the January light, because the kale was still holding on and someone had to keep watch. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched her. Outside, the mountains sat in their particular winter stillness, cold and enormous and indifferent to county hearings and formal complaints and the question of who belonged where. The ranch was quiet. The stove ticked behind her. Somewhere upstairs, Eli was drawing, and Molly was talking to her animals with the seriousness she brought to all conversations. The family was still here. Clara was still here. That had to be where they started. Whatever came next, the hearing, the testimony, The public accounting of everything she'd done and hadn't done and been and wasn't. They would start from the simple fact of still being here. She turned away from the window and went back to the accounts, because the accounts still needed doing and someone still had to keep the house running while everything else was uncertain. That was, she was finding, often how it worked. The ordinary things kept going even when the important things were in question. Maybe that was what ordinary things were for. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the strangest Clara had lived through in a long time, and she had lived through some strange ones. The ranch kept running. That was the thing about necessity. It didn't stop being necessary because you were frightened. The cattle still needed feeding, the cold frame still needed checking, the accounts still needed doing. Eli still came downstairs in the mornings and drew at the kitchen table before school. Molly still required someone to braid her hair with the particular specifications she had developed, which involved no bumps and a bow that was tied a certain way and would inform you with great seriousness if you'd done it wrong. The ordinary structure of the days held, and Clara held on to it the way you held on to something fixed when the ground was moving. But underneath the ordinary structure, things were shifting. People in Millhaven knew about the hearing. Small towns were efficient that way. The county letter had arrived on a Thursday, and by Saturday when Gideon went in for supplies, the knowledge was already everywhere. In the careful way people didn't quite look at him, and the pointed way some of them did. Halverson at the general store was polite as always, which Clara had decided meant he was a decent man. 2 other men she didn't know well stopped Gideon outside to say they thought the whole business was overreach, which was something. The balance of the visible town, however, seemed to be waiting, watching to see how it would go, withholding judgment in the way that was different from withholding support. Clara went into town with Gideon that Saturday. She had considered not going, and then decided that not going was a form of hiding, and she was not going to hide. She walked through the general store and bought what she needed, and made eye contact with the people who met her eyes and let the others do what they wanted. Frances Crane said, in the near hearing distance that was technically deniable, "Some women don't know their place." Clara kept walking. Outside, Gideon had heard it. He didn't say anything until they were loading the wagon, and then he said, "You don't have to come to town with me." "I know," Clara said. "I'm coming anyway." He looked at her. "If I let them push me into smaller and smaller spaces," Clara said, "I'll run out of space. I've done that before. I'm not doing it again." Gideon held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to loading. The preparation for the hearing was Gideon's idea, and it was more methodical than Clara had expected from a man she'd primarily known as physical and practical rather than strategic. He came to her with a list, written on the back of a receipt, 3 days after the county letter arrived. "I want to know everything about how this works," he said. "The hearing process, what they can ask, what we can say, how decisions get made." "I don't know most of that," Clara said. "Neither do I. But I know someone who might." He sat down. "There's a lawyer in Brentwood named Morrison who handled the deed dispute on the eastern pasture when we first settled here. He was expensive, but he knew what he was doing. I'm going to write to him." "That'll cost—" "I know what it'll cost," Gideon said. Clara looked at him. "We have the $36 from the Harper back payment," he said. "I was holding it for the spring fence repair. The fence can wait." She didn't argue. He wrote the letter that evening, and they had a reply from Morrison by the following Wednesday, which was fast enough that he'd either used a fast courier or had been expecting the kind of work that came from places like Millhaven. Morrison's letter was professional and dense, and Clara read it twice. What it said, distilled. A county welfare hearing was not a court proceeding, which meant it had less formal structure but also less protection. The county investigator would present his findings. The complainants could speak. The subject of the complaint, Gideon, and by extension Clara, could speak and present witnesses. The decision would be made by the county welfare officer, Cade Superior, who would attend in person. The most important factor in these proceedings, Morrison wrote, is not legal precedent, but community standing. The officer will want to know what the community believes. Come with as many credible voices as possible. Gideon showed her this passage. "Community standing," Clara said. "Yes." "My community standing in Millhaven is—" "Not the point," Gideon said. "Not your standing. The standing of the household, of the children, who can speak to what they've seen." Clara thought about this. "Miss Alderman." "I was thinking the same thing. And Halverson, he's seen us every week. He's not unfriendly. There's also Jim Taggart, who runs the South Pasture lease next to ours. His wife has seen you in town a dozen times. She's not—" He stopped. "She's cautious, but she's fair." "You'd have to ask her directly," Clara said. "People are more cautious when they're asked to be on record." "I know." Gideon looked at the list on the receipt. "And the children. Sadie said she wants to speak. She's 12. Morrison says there's no age restriction on testimony, just that it has to be voluntary, and the child has to be able to speak clearly." Clara looked at the window. Outside it was that particular February gray, overcast and heavy, the sky and the land almost the same color. "Sadie speaks clearly," she said. "More clearly than most adults I know," Gideon said. They asked Miss Alderman first because she was in town and because she'd already indicated, in the note about Eli's portrait, that she saw the household in a favorable light. She was a small woman of about 50 with sharp eyes, and the efficient manner of someone who had spent 20 years managing classrooms of frontier children and had not survived it by being soft. She listened to Gideon's explanation with her hands folded on her desk and her expression neutral. And when he was finished, she said, "What do you need from me?" "To speak at the hearing," Gideon said. "About Eli. About what you've observed. I've observed a child who came back to school in October who was, frankly, more lost than any student I've had in a long while, who didn't speak in class and whose work was failing." She looked at Clara. "I've also observed that by January he was one of my stronger readers. His arithmetic had caught up, and he'd begun speaking in class with more confidence than several children twice his composure." She paused. "I noticed the change. I didn't know it was connected to you specifically." "It's connected to several things," Clara said. "He's a resilient child. He was always going to come back." "Perhaps," Miss Alderman said. "But he came back on a particular schedule that began in October." She looked at Gideon. "I'll speak at the hearing. I'll say what I've seen. That's all I can offer, but it's accurate." "That's all we're asking," Gideon said. Halverson was simpler. He was a straightforward man who had sold supplies to the Mercer Ranch for 3 years, and when Gideon asked him if he'd be willing to speak, he said, "I don't get involved in county business usually." "I know," Gideon said, "but I'll tell you this." Halverson set down the tin he'd been shelving and looked at Gideon. "I've watched that woman come in here every week for 4 months and carry herself with more dignity than half this town, and the children that come in with her look like children who are being properly cared for. That's what I see." He picked the tin back up. "If you need me to say that out loud at a hearing, I can say it out loud." He put the tin on the shelf. "That's what happened," he said. "I'm not adding anything." "That's enough," Gideon said. Taggart's wife, a sturdy woman named Dora, who had the slightly sun-weathered look of every woman who had made a life on the frontier, agreed to speak after a longer conversation at their kitchen table that involved coffee and 2 of her own children wandering in and out and being redirected. She was not effortlessly warm about it. There was a hesitation in her, a weighing of social costs that she didn't hide. But she said yes in the end, with the particularity of a woman who had made up her own mind. "I'm not saying anything for you," she said to Clara, who had sat quietly through most of the conversation. "I'm saying what I've seen." "That's all I'd want," Clara said. "I saw you in town in November," Dora said, "with all 3 children and the little one on your hip. The way you handled that, a child that age in a store is a trial, and you were patient, not performing patience, actually patient." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I notice because it's harder than it looks, and most people get it wrong." Clara didn't say anything. "I've got 4, Dora said. "I know the difference." Looked out. Sadie asked to speak to Clara alone, 2 days before the hearing. They were in the bedroom Clara had come to think of as her room, which she hadn't fully thought of as her room until the county letter had made it seem possible it might not be. And Sadie sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, in the particular posture she had when she was thinking through something large. "I want to know what to say," Sadie said. "I can't tell you what to say. I mean—" Sadie stopped. "I know what I want to say. I want to know if it's the right thing to say." "Tell me what you're thinking." Sadie looked at her hands. "I want to tell them about Mama." Clara was quiet. Not to make them feel sorry, Sadie said quickly, with a 12-year-old's horror of being seen as manipulative. I want to tell them what it was like after, and then what it was like after you came. Not to compare you to her. I know you're not her, and I don't want you to be her, but I want them to understand what was happening and then what happened when it stopped. That's a hard thing to say in a room full of people, Clara said. I know. It's also the truest thing anyone could say. Sadie looked up. If you can say it the way you just said it to me, Clara said, it's enough. You don't have to make it bigger than it is. Just say what was true. What if I cry? Then you cry. It doesn't make the truth less true. Sadie looked at her for a long moment. She had her father's eyes and her mother's precision and something that was entirely her own, something that had been forged in the particular crucible of being 12 years old and the oldest child in a grieving household, and understanding everything that was happening while not being old enough to have any power over any of it. Are you scared? Sadie asked. Clara considered lying. She rejected it. Yes, she said. Of what? Of what happens if it goes wrong? Of what it would mean for you three. She paused. Not for me. For you. Sadie absorbed this. What would happen to you if it went wrong? I'd leave, Clara said plainly. I'd find another position somewhere else. I'd be all right. But you don't want to leave. It was not a question. Sadie was 12 and she had excellent instincts. No, Clara said, I don't want to leave. Sadie nodded slowly, like someone filing away important information. Then she stood up from the bed and straightened her skirt and said, Then we need to make sure it doesn't go wrong. She left the room with the brisk determination of someone who had decided a problem was solvable and was now going to solve it, which was so purely her mother's energy, apparently, that Gideon, who had been passing in the hall, stopped and put a hand briefly on the wall and just stood there for a second. Clara saw him do it. He didn't know she saw him. She turned back to the window and let him have it. So, the 12th of February was cold and clear. They drove into Millhaven in the wagon, all 5 of them. The children in the back under blankets because the morning was sharp enough to sting. Nobody said very much on the drive. Eli had his sketchbook but wasn't drawing in it, just holding it. Molly had both Button and Rabbit, which she'd been allowed to bring because Clara had decided this was not the morning to draw lines about stuffed animals. The community hall was already half full when they arrived. This surprised Clara, though it probably shouldn't have. A county welfare hearing in a town the size of Millhaven was significant entertainment by local standards, and she had seen enough of small-town interest in other people's troubles to know that a crowd didn't indicate opinion so much as curiosity. The crowd would form its opinion as the morning went on. She came in with her head up. There were people she recognized and people she didn't. Margaret Hollis was there, near the front, with Frances Crane and 2 women Claire had seen in town but hadn't spoken to. Halverson was there, toward the back, with his hands in his pockets and his usual expression. Dora Taggart was in the middle section. Miss Alderman was near the front opposite side from Margaret Hollis, which felt like a statement even if it wasn't. The county welfare officer was a man named Reeves, heavy-set and in his 50s with a gray beard and the look of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have stopped being surprised by any of it. He sat at a table at the front with Cade and Foss and a woman who appeared to be taking official notes. Gideon found seats for Clara and the children near the front. Clara sat between him and Eli, which put her next to Gideon, which felt either deliberate or accidental, and she chose not to decide which. Reeves opened the proceedings with a brief explanation of the format, which mostly confirmed what Morrison's letter had said. Cade would present his findings, the complaint party would speak, the subject of the complaint would respond, and witnesses for both sides could address the gathering. Reeves would ask questions as needed and would make his determination within a week. Cade's presentation was careful and not particularly hostile. He described the initial complaint, his visit to the ranch, his observations, and his conversation with the children. He noted that he had found no evidence of physical neglect or immediate harm. He noted the community concern. He said it with the measured evenness of a man presenting data rather than argument, and Clara gave him credit for that. Then Margaret Hollis stood up. She was, Clara would admit, a formidable woman in the specific way of formidable women who had never needed to fight outside their own sphere, confident in her standing, clear in her purpose, genuinely convinced of the rightness of what she was doing. That was the hardest kind to argue with in Clara's experience, because there was no bad faith to point to. Margaret spoke for several minutes. She talked about community standards. She talked about the importance of a moral example for children. She talked about the welfare of 3 motherless children who deserved, in her view, a properly constituted household. She talked about the Denver family, who were apparently relatives of hers and had been willing to take the children out of genuine concern. She talked about Clara by name, carefully, without cruelty, without anything that could be called cruelty. She expressed doubt. She questioned judgment. She used words like appropriate and suitable in the particular way those words got used when what was meant was the opposite. When she sat down, the room was listening. Reeves said, "Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitmore, you may respond." Gideon stood up. He was not a man who liked speaking in public. Clara could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight stiffness of someone who was doing something that didn't come easily. He stood at the front of the hall with his hat in his hands and looked at the room. "My wife died 14 months ago," he said. "Eleanor. She was sick less than 2 weeks. We had 3 children, and I had a ranch to run, and I did the best I could. And my best wasn't enough for the children. That's the truth." He paused. "I looked for help for months. I found Clara Whitmore. I hired her. She is a capable woman who has worked in my household for 4 months and has done nothing except her job, which she has done better than I had any right to hope for." The room was quiet. "The suggestion that her presence is harmful to my children," Gideon said, "is wrong. I'll hear anyone in this room say what harm has been done specifically to any of my children, not what might happen, not what people think, what harm has actually occurred." He looked at Margaret Hollis. "Because I haven't seen any." He sat down. Then Clara stood up. She had not planned a speech. She had thought about what she might say and had rejected several versions, all of which were either too defensive or too aggressive or too much about her own feelings, which were not the point. She stood in front of the hall and looked at the faces looking back at her, and she spoke plainly. "I came to this ranch in October," she said. "I was hired to keep a house and care for children. That's what I've done. I can account for every hour of every day I've been there." She looked at the county officer. "The question being raised is whether my presence as an unmarried woman is itself a harm to the children, regardless of what I've actually done. I'd ask the county to consider whether that's a standard being applied consistently. Whether a married woman who neglected those children would face this hearing. Whether the complaint is about what has happened or what someone has decided might happen." She paused. "The children are not harmed. They are fed and warm and in school and improving. If that is the county's actual concern, the evidence answers it." She sat down. Reeves said, "Witnesses?" Miss Alderman went first. She stood with the composure of a woman who had been giving considered assessments of children's progress for 20 years and was not intimidated by a county hearing. She talked about Eli, specifically, factually, without embellishment, where he had been in October, where he was in February, the measurable differences. She used the word remarkable once, about his recovery and reading comprehension, and then used significant about everything else, because she was a teacher and teachers knew the weight of understatement. When she sat down, Clara heard a shift in the room, something less settled. Halverson stood up and said what he'd told Gideon he would say, in the flat, direct way of a man who wasn't interested in rhetoric. "I see a lot of families in this town. That woman does right by those children. I don't see the harm." He sat down. Dora Taggart stood up. She said what she'd told Clara she would say, about what she'd observed, about patience, about the difference between performing care and practicing it. She said it in the steady, unpretty way of a woman speaking from her own experience, and the women in the room who had 4 children of their own listened to her. Then the room went quiet, and Clara thought that was the witnesses, and she thought, it might be enough. It might not be enough. It was impossible to know. Then Sadie stood up. She stood up from her seat without asking permission or waiting to be called on, and the room looked at her. This 12-year-old girl in her good dress, with her hair done properly, with her mother's precision and her own earned gravity. Reeves looked at her. "Young lady, I want to speak," Sadie said. A pause. Reeves looked at Gideon. Gideon nodded. "All right," Reeves said. "Come forward." Sadie walked to the front of the hall with the deliberateness of someone who has decided exactly what they're doing and is not going to be talked out of it. She stood where her father and Clara had stood, and she looked at the room. "My mother's name was Eleanor Mercer," she said. "She died 14 months ago. I was 11. She said it without preamble, without softening, because Sadie had never softened anything in her life. "I know why we're here. Someone decided that having Miss Clara in our house is wrong because she isn't married to my father. I want to tell you what the house was like before she came," she told them. She told them in plain language that was more devastating than any dramatic language would have been, about the way the house had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, the kind that lives where something used to be. About her father working until dark every day and coming in with nothing left. About Eli, who had stopped talking. About Molly, who cried at night and didn't understand why. About herself, being 12 years old and the oldest and trying to be what everyone needed and knowing she was falling short. The hall was very still. "Miss Clara came in October," Sadie said. "She didn't try to be my mother. She didn't try to make us forget her. She learned how my mother did the garden because she said it was the right way, and she kept doing it her way, even when she didn't have to. She fixed the things that were broken. She made Eli draw again." Her voice had stayed level this whole time, with the specific effort of someone holding it level, and it was that effort that was most visible, more visible than any tears would have been. "My brother laughed at dinner last month. I had forgotten what that sounded like." She stopped. "Taking us away from this," she said, "and calling that protecting us. I'd like someone here to explain that to me, because I'm 12 and I don't understand it." She went back to her seat. The room was quiet for a long moment. And then something happened that Clara hadn't expected and that she would remember for the rest of her life. A woman in the middle of the hall, a woman Clara didn't recognize, with a tired face and work-worn hands and a baby on her hip, said, "She's right." Not loudly, almost conversationally, as if she'd thought it and it had come out. The woman next to her said, "Yes." Someone near the back cleared their throat. A man's voice said, "This is a family business. County had no cause to come into it." "The child said it plainly enough," said another voice. The room was not unanimous. Margaret Hollis sat very straight, and Frances Crane's expression had not changed, and two of the supporting witnesses were looking at their hands. But the room was not what it had been 20 minutes ago. The quality of the listening had changed, from the slightly prurient attention of a crowd watching someone else's problem to something more like discomfort. The particular discomfort of people who have been involved in something and are beginning to suspect they got it wrong. Reeves had been watching the room. He was an experienced man, and experienced men in his position were readers of rooms. He wrote something in his ledger. "I'll make my determination within the week," he said, as stated. They drove home in the afternoon light. Molly had fallen asleep against Clara's side in the back of the wagon, one hand still wrapped around Button the horse. Eli was actually drawing this time, something small and fast in the corner of his sketchbook, not looking up. Sadie was sitting upright in the way she sat when she had expended something significant and was now recovering. Gideon drove. Clara sat in the back with the children. Nobody said much. About halfway home, Eli said, without looking up from his drawing, "Did it work?" "We'll know in a week," Clara said. "But did it feel like it worked?" Clara looked at the mountains in the late afternoon light, the long shadows coming down across the snow. "Yes," she said. "It felt like it worked." Eli went back to his drawing. Sadie, who had been looking at the road ahead, turned and looked at Clara, not with a question in her expression, just looking. The way she'd looked at her that first day on the porch, with those careful, watchful eyes, taking measure. Only different now. The measure had already been taken. This was something else. "Thank you for staying," Sadie said. It was quiet. It was direct. It was entirely Sadie. Clara held it for a moment, the weight of it, this 12-year-old girl saying what adults often couldn't, just the simple necessary thing. "Thank you for what you did in there," Clara said. Sadie turned back to the road. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Up front, Gideon's shoulders had a different set to them than they'd had that morning. Less braced, like something he'd been holding had been put down, at least partially. Not resolved, because the week wasn't over and the determination wasn't made. but a different weight. Clara sat with the sleeping Molly and the drawing Eli and the quiet Sadie and the mountains going golden in the late light, and she thought, whatever comes next, this happened. This day happened, and it cannot be taken back. These children stood up in a public hall and told the truth about their lives, and the truth was heard. That was something. That was not nothing. The ranch came into view at the bend in the road. The house, the barn, the south pasture with the cattle as dark shapes against the snow. It looked, in the late light, like what it was, a place that had been built by people who meant to stay. Clara looked at it and felt the particular ache of wanting something you weren't sure you were allowed to want. She was still working on that part. But she was here, and the week would pass, and whatever Reeves decided, she had done what she came to do. She had stayed. The wagon turned into the long drive. They were home. The week that followed the hearing was the longest Clara could remember since the 4 days on the stagecoach to Mill Haven, and those had at least had the mercy of forward motion. This was just waiting, which was something she had never been particularly good at. She kept to the routine. Routine was the only thing she knew how to do with uncertainty. Fill the hours with what needed doing, and don't let the waiting sit in the middle of the room like furniture. The stove got lit at 5. The bread got made. The accounts got their weekly review. The cold frames got checked because February in Colorado could turn without warning, and she had kale she was not going to lose to inattention. The children felt the waiting too, each in their own way. Molly asked twice on the first day when the man with the notebook was coming back, and when Clara said she didn't know, Molly accepted this with the pragmatic fatalism of a 4-year-old and went back to her animals. Eli drew more than usual, not the focused, purposeful drawing he did when he was working through something, but the compulsive kind, pages filling up fast with horses and landscapes, and once, on Thursday, a drawing of the kitchen table from his angle at it, with Clara's hands visible at the edge of the frame working on something. She found the drawing when she was tidying and stood with it for a moment before setting it carefully back in his sketchbook. Sadie said almost nothing about the hearing after they got home, but she did something Clara noticed. She started doing the things she'd stopped doing in the worst months after her mother died. She set the table without being asked. She swept the porch on Wednesday morning in the cold, which was not a necessary job in February, but was the kind of job you did when you needed to do something with your hands. On Thursday evening, she came downstairs after the younger children were in bed and sat at the kitchen table while Clara worked on the mending. And they didn't talk, just occupied the same room, which was Sadie's version of closeness, and Clara had learned to recognize it. On Friday, Gideon came in from the afternoon chores and said, "Letter from Reeves." Clara set down what she was doing. He brought it to the kitchen table and set it in front of her, and they both sat down and he opened it. She read it alongside him, both of them at the same page, which meant she caught his exhale before she got to the end. The county welfare office, having reviewed the evidence presented at the hearing of February 12th, found no grounds to determine that the welfare of the minor children residing at the Mercer property was compromised. The complaint was formally closed. No further investigation was warranted. Below that, in what appeared to be Reeves's own handwriting rather than the formal typeface of the rest, the testimony of the Mercer children was compelling and consistent. The household appears to be functioning adequately, and the children's well-being is evident. I see no basis for county intervention. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down on the table. She had expected relief. What she got was something closer to the aftermath of relief. The feeling that came after the thing you'd been braced for had not happened, when the tension that had been holding you together for 2 weeks suddenly had nothing to push against. She sat very still for a moment. "Clara," Gideon said. "I'm fine," she said. "I know, but you don't have to be fine immediately." She looked at him. He was watching her with the quiet attention she'd learned meant he was paying close attention and choosing not to make it obvious. She looked back at the letter. "It's over," she said, testing the shape of it. "It's over." She nodded. Then she got up because sitting still wasn't possible anymore, and she went to the stove because the coffee had been sitting too long, and she needed to do something with her hands, and she stood at the stove and took 3 or 4 slow breaths, which helped. "I'm going to tell the children," Gideon said. "Wait until dinner," Clara said. "Tell them together." He did. He told them at dinner, straight out, the way he told them everything. Without decoration, just the facts. The county had closed the case. They were staying. Everything was the same. Molly said, "Good. with the comprehensive satisfaction of someone for whom this had always been the only acceptable outcome, and went back to eating. Eli looked at his plate for a moment. Then he looked up at Clara and said, "I knew it would work." "You said you didn't know," Clara reminded him. "I knew," he said. "I just said I didn't know, so you wouldn't think I was being naive." This was so unexpected that Clara almost laughed. "That's a very complicated strategy for 6. 7, Eli said. "My birthday was 2 weeks ago." "I know when your birthday was," Clara said. "I made the cake." "Then you should know I'm 7. Gideon was looking at the table with the expression he got when something amused him that he wasn't going to admit amused him. Sadie said nothing at dinner. After, when Clara was washing up, and the younger children had gone upstairs, Sadie came to stand beside her at the sink and picked up the drying cloth without being asked, the way she sometimes did. They washed and dried in silence for a while. Then Sadie said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." "Are you going to stay? After this, I mean, now that the hearing is done and now that things are normal again. Are you going to stay?" Clara passed her a plate. "That would depend on whether your father still wants me here." "He does." "He might want to tell me that himself." Sadie dried the plate with more attention than a plate required. "I'm asking you, though, if it was up to you." Clara thought about $42. She thought about the note from Douglas Farwell. She thought about the boarding house in Decatur and the church hall in Springfield, and every position that had ended badly through no clear fault of either party. She thought about 8 miles on a rented horse with wet skirts, and the girl on the porch steps, who had watched her with those careful eyes. "Yes," she said. "If it were up to me, I'd stay." Sadie put the plate in the cupboard. She picked up the next one. "Good," she said, in the same tone Molly had used about the hearing, and that was all. It was Gideon who made it up to her, though that wasn't how she'd have described it. What happened was this. 3 days after the letter from Reeves, on a Sunday morning when the children had gone to visit Dora Taggart, whose own children had apparently formed a particular alliance with Eli over the shared interest of drawing horses, Dora had sent word that her eldest had a book of animal illustrations they wanted to show him. Gideon and Clara were alone in the kitchen for the first time in what felt like months. He'd been doing the accounts. She'd been working on the week's bread. The kitchen had the comfortable rhythm it always had when there was work being done in it, the kind of domestic quiet that had stopped feeling awkward between them sometime in November. He said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "What happens next year?" He wasn't looking up from the ledger. "The Harper lease comes up for renewal in the spring. If we renegotiate it properly, it brings in enough to hire a second hand for the summer, which means the cattle operation can expand." He turned a page. "The accounts are in better shape than they've been since Eleanor died. Partly the Harper situation, partly—" He stopped. "Partly that they're being managed properly for the first time in over a year." "The accounts aren't complicated," Clara said. "They just need doing." "Clara." She looked at him. He had closed the ledger and was looking at her directly, which was not his usual posture when he was about to say something significant. His usual posture was to look at something nearby that wasn't her face, the table or the window or the middle distance. This was different. "I've been doing this badly," he said. She waited. "Saying things sideways because I didn't know how to say them straight. Relying on you to read between lines when I should have been saying the lines." He put both hands flat on the table. "So I'm going to say it straight." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper. As my wife, if that's something you'd want. If it isn't, if I've read this wrong, I'd rather know that plainly than keep—" He stopped. "I'm not asking because of the children, or the accounts, or the hearing. I'm asking because you're—" He stopped again, looked at the table, looked back up. "You're the first person I've wanted to talk to in the morning in a long time. That's the plainest way I can say it." Clara stood at the kitchen counter with flour on her hands. She had kept herself from this. She had been careful and consistent and had redirected herself every time she'd been about to want something she wasn't positioned to want. She had been good at it, mostly. She had told herself it was the right approach, the reasonable approach. The approach of a woman who had learned not to build things in her head that would come down. She had not apparently been as successful as she'd thought, because when he said it, plainly, imperfectly, with the slight roughness of a man who found words hard and had made himself use them anyway, She felt it land somewhere she'd been pretending wasn't there. "You've been making me coffee in the mornings," she said, "since November." "Yes, I noticed that." "I thought you might." "And the shutters," she said. "You fixed the shutters before the porch rail, and they weren't on the top of the list." "The shutters bothered me," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "They were fine. They looked bad from the road." "You can't see them from the road." "From the south approach you can." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "Yes," she said. "Yes what?" "Yes, it's something I'd want." She set down what she was doing, which still had flour on her hands, and looked at him across the kitchen. I want you to know what you're getting. I'm plain-spoken, and I have opinions about account management, and I'll probably argue with you about the fence repairs because you keep putting off the north section, and it's going to be a problem in spring." "I know about the north section." "Then why is it still at the bottom of the list?" "Because I was hoping it would sort itself out." "Fences don't sort themselves out." "Clara." "What?" "I know what I'm getting," he said. "That's why I asked." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him, this tired, serious, grief-worn man who had made her coffee in the morning since November and fixed the wrong shutters and listened to her about accounts, and asked her, plainly, without decoration, to stay. "All right," she said. It was not romantic in the way stories were romantic. There was no particular ceremony to it, no grand moment. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and she had flour on her hands, and he had the accounts open on the table, and outside the mountains were doing what they always did, which was nothing in particular, being very large and very cold and entirely indifferent. But he got up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and she didn't step back. And that was how it started, not with elegance, but with the particular honesty of two people deciding to be honest with each other. Bon? The children came back from the Taggarts in the early afternoon. Eli came through the door first, talking about the illustration book before he was fully inside, and Molly came in after him still wearing her coat and wanting to tell Clara something important about Dora Taggart's cat. And Sadie came in last and took one look at her father and then at Clara and stopped in the doorway. She looked at them. Not at one and then the other. At both. At the same time. With those 12-year-old eyes that missed nothing. "Something happened," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. Sadie waited. "I asked Clara to marry me," Gideon said. She said yes. A silence. Eli stopped talking about the book. Molly looked up from whatever she'd been doing with her coat buttons. Sadie stood in the doorway for a long moment that Clara could not read. Not the usual waiting expression. Something different. Something that was processing at a depth that didn't show on the surface. Then she said, "Is this because of the hearing? Because you think it'll stop people from talking?" "No," Gideon said. "It has nothing to do with the hearing." "Because that would be a bad reason," Sadie said. "For both of you." "I know that," Gideon said. "That's not the reason." Another pause. Sadie looked at Clara. "Is it what you want?" she said. And Clara, who had sat with this girl in the cold garden and told her she couldn't promise the future and had meant it, said, "Yes, it's what I want." Sadie nodded once. Then she came inside and hung up her coat and said, "You should fix the north fence section before the wedding. It'll look bad in the photographs." Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Eli, who had been processing all of this, said, "Does that mean you're staying forever?" "That's the plan," Clara said. Eli considered this with the seriousness he brought to all significant matters. Then he picked up his sketchbook. "I'm going to draw the wedding," he said, "as a series. I'll document the whole thing." "That's very ambitious," Clara said. "I have time," Eli said. "When is it?" "We haven't decided yet," Gideon said. "You should decide soon," Eli said. "I need to plan the series." Molly, who had been listening to all of this with her coat half off, and buttoned the horse in the crook of her arm, looked at Clara and said, "Does this mean I can call you Mama?" The kitchen went quiet. Clara felt it. The word, the weight of it, enormous and uncomplicated in Molly's mouth, the thing she hadn't known how to say or whether she'd ever be in the position to hear. She looked at Gideon. His expression was carefully held. "That's up to you," Clara said to Molly slowly. "You can call me whatever feels right." Molly looked at Button, then at Rabbit, then at Clara. "Mama Clara," she said, with the decisive tone of someone who has resolved a complex problem through pure instinct. She put her coat on the hook, crookedly, needing a straightening that Clara would do automatically in about 4 minutes, and went to the kitchen table and climbed up and started telling Clara about the Taggart's cat in great detail, as if the last 5 minutes had been a minor administrative matter now satisfactorily concluded. Sadie was watching Clara from across the kitchen. Clara looked back at her. Sadie gave her one small, deliberate nod, the nod of someone who has been measuring something for months and has arrived at a final conclusion, and then went upstairs to change her clothes. Cheb, they were married in April, not with ceremony and not with a crowd. Morrison the lawyer came from Brentwood with the necessary paperwork because Gideon had decided a legal document was cleaner and more durable than a social occasion, which was the most practical approach to a wedding Clara had ever heard, and which suited her entirely. Halverson stood as witness. Dora Taggart stood as the second. The children were there, obviously. Molly in a dress she had strong feelings about. Eli with his sketchbook. Sadie with her hands folded and her expression serious and her eyes bright. It took about 20 minutes, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house where Clara had first made bread and cleaned the base of the stove and sat across from a tired widower drinking coffee that was too strong. Afterward, Dora Taggart produced a cake she'd made without telling anyone, which she set on the table with the practical efficiency of a woman who understood that occasions required some acknowledgement, and Molly announced that this was the best day, which was the most extravagant statement a 4-year-old was capable of, and Eli showed everyone the preliminary sketches for the wedding documentation series, which was actually quite good. Gideon signed the last of the papers and looked at Clara. "Mercer," he said. "Mercer," she agreed. It didn't feel like a movie. It didn't feel like the end of something long and difficult. It felt like a Tuesday afternoon in a kitchen that smelled like Dora Taggart's cake, with too many people and not quite enough chairs and Molly spilling something almost immediately. It felt, in other words, like life. Summer came. The north fence section got repaired in March, before the wedding, which Sadie had requested and Gideon had actually done, which Clara noted without saying anything about it. The cattle expanded, as planned. 12 new head in the spring, which brought the operation to a size that justified the second hand. A quiet man named Pete Allard, who worked hard and ate twice what anyone else did, and got along with the children by virtue of generally leaving them alone, which Eli in particular appreciated. The garden was the best it had been in at least 2 years by Sadie's assessment, which was the authoritative one. The kale from the cold frames had survived the whole winter, which Clara considered a personal achievement. The carrots came in good in June, and the tomatoes in July were better than expected given the dry spell in late spring. Eli got through second grade without hitting anyone with his lunchbox, which Miss Alderman noted in her end-of-year letter in a way that suggested she considered it a meaningful milestone. His reading was the strongest in the class. He had begun, that summer, to show his drawings to people other than the immediate family. Something small, a step toward the world, taken with the caution of someone who has been burned but has decided to try again. Lucy Whitfield, the girl who had said his horses were better than anything she'd seen, had become a kind of friend, which surprised Eli more than anyone. Thomas Briggs had moved away in March, which Eli learned from Sadie without particular comment, and which Clara noticed he received with more relief than satisfaction, because he was not a child who enjoyed other people's misfortune, even the misfortune of people who had been unkind to him. That was not something she'd taught him. It was just who he was. Molly turned 5 in August. She had a birthday party, which she had requested, and which Clara threw in the way she did everything, practically, without fuss, with a cake that was not beautiful, but tasted excellent, which Molly considered the correct priority. 3 children from town came, including a girl named Ada, whose mother had been one of the women at the hearing who had said yes when Sadie spoke. That woman and Clara were not friends exactly, but they acknowledged each other in town now in a way that was warmer than before, which was enough. Margaret Hollis was still in Millhaven. Clara saw her sometimes. They did not speak much. What there was between them was not resolved exactly, and was not going to be resolved into friendship. It had settled into a kind of mutual recognition, not warmth, not the absence of tension, but the acknowledgement that they occupied the same town, and the hearing was done, and neither of them was going anywhere. Once, in the general store, Margaret had looked at Molly on Clara's hip, and then at Clara and said, "She's growing." Clara had said, "They do." And that was the extent of it. It was sufficient. It was the actual world, not the resolved one. But in September, a year after Clara had first arrived, Sadie turned 13. She asked for one thing for her birthday, to plant a new section of the garden the following spring, her own design. Gideon said yes before she'd finished the sentence. Clara said she'd help with the soil preparation. Sadie said she didn't need help with the soil preparation, which was true, and also wasn't the point, which Sadie knew. On the evening of her birthday, after the younger children were in bed, Sadie came out to the porch where Clara was sitting. She sat down beside her. The September air had the early edge of autumn in it. Not cold yet, but the warning of cold, the shift that preceded everything changing. "Can I ask you something?" Sadie said. "You always ask that and then ask anyway," Clara said. "I know, but some things should get asked first." She looked at the mountains in the dark. "Do you think you were always going to end up here? Like, is there a version of your life where you didn't come?" Clara thought about this seriously, the way she tried to think about all of Sadie's real questions. "There's a version where I was too scared to answer the advertisement," she said, "where I stayed in Decatur and got another position, and it probably ended badly, and I moved on and eventually found something that worked out adequately." She paused. "I think I would have been all right. I've been all right before." But all right is not the same as this." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "Do you think my mother would—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not asking if she'd like you. I know that's not a thing you can answer. I'm asking something different." "What are you asking?" Sadie looked at her hands. "I'm asking if it's okay to be happy about this, about how things are now, when the reason things changed is because she's gone." Her voice was steady, but it had that quality it got sometimes, the holding level quality, the effort beneath the surface. "It feels like being glad she died. And I know it's not that, but sometimes it feels like it." Clara sat with this for a moment. She did not rush to reassure because Sadie didn't need the fast reassurance. She needed the honest one. "I think those two things can both be true at the same time," Clara said. "Missing her and being glad about what's here now. They don't cancel each other out. Grief doesn't work on that kind of math." She paused. "Being happy about your life is not the same as being glad for the loss. You can love your mother and grieve her and still want this. All of it can be true." Sadie didn't say anything for a while. "She would have wanted it," she said finally. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. She was practical. She would have looked at the situation and decided what it needed and gone from there." She glanced at Clara sideways. "You're actually kind of similar in that way." "Don't tell her that," Clara said. Sadie almost smiled. "She knows." They sat on the porch in the September dark and listened to the ranch settle around them. The particular night sounds, the cattle in the south pasture, the barn door Gideon had fixed 3 weeks ago that no longer creaked, a sky that went on longer than you could track, more stars than you could count, the mountains just visible as darker shapes against the dark. "I'm glad you came," Sadie said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm glad too." They sat a while longer and then went inside because it was getting cold, and there was school in the morning. This is what Clara understood, by September of that year, that she hadn't understood when she'd arrived. She had spent the years before believing that unwanted was a fixed state, a condition you were born into or fell into and stayed in, that it was something inherent to her rather than circumstantial, a verdict rather than a set of bad coincidences in a series of wrong places. She had carried it the way people carried things they'd been told were theirs to carry. She'd gotten good at it. She'd built her whole understanding of herself around the management of it. What she hadn't seen, couldn't have seen from inside it, was that the problem was never her. The problem was the category. The people who had rejected her or dismissed her or pushed her out had been working with a set of requirements that she didn't fit, that she had never fit. And the mistake had been in treating those requirements as objective rather than particular. Douglas Farwell had wanted a different kind of woman, and he'd been right to recognize she wasn't it. The positions that had ended badly because she'd been in the wrong household, with the wrong people, trying to fit shapes she was never going to fit. She had not been unwanted in any absolute sense. She had been in the wrong places. Here was the right place. Here were the right people. Imperfect people. A man who communicated sideways, and a girl who said what adults couldn't, and a boy who spoke in drawings, and a small child who had named both her stuffed animals and considered this the natural order of things. None of them were what anyone would have designed for her. None of them had been simple, but they had chosen her each in their own particular way, with their eyes open to exactly who she was. That was the thing about belonging. It wasn't granted. It wasn't found in the places you were supposed to look. It was built, slowly, out of ordinary days and difficult ones, out of accounts and garden rows and mending done by lamplight and conversations that ran too long in cold kitchens. It was the accumulation of being there, of choosing to keep being there, of staying when staying cost something. She hadn't arrived at the Mercer Ranch and found a home. She had made one. They all had together, out of what had been there, grief and stubbornness, and 3 children who needed someone to stay, and a woman who had finally stopped looking for a reason to go. The following spring, Sadie's new garden section was planted. She had designed it through the winter on paper, with the same precision she brought to everything, and when the ground thawed, she went out with her plan and her tools and began. Clara helped with the soil preparation, which Sadie accepted without comment, and which meant she'd always intended to accept it. Gideon watched from the porch with his morning coffee. The coffee that Clara now made, that they shared in the mornings before the children were up, in the kitchen where they'd had the first hard conversation and many others after it. Eli came out eventually and sat on the fence to watch and made 3 sketches of Sadie working that he presented to her that evening, which she accepted with a brisk nod that meant she was pleased. Molly helped by carrying things from one place to another in the serious, deliberate way she helped with things, occasionally reorganizing a location Clara had just established, which required quiet undoing, which was the particular nature of help from 5-year-olds. The land was soft from the melt. The mountains had their spring look, more white than they would have in June, the snow line lower than it would be in summer, every peak sharp against a sky that had the particular blue of high altitude in early April. Clara knelt in the turned earth with flowers still on her fingers from the morning bread. She hadn't changed her boots properly and had come out anyway because the morning was too good to stay inside, and felt the damp cold of it and thought, this is the thing. Not the hearing, not the letter from Reeves, not the wedding in the kitchen with Morrison's paperwork. Not any specific moment. This. The ordinary Tuesday of it. The fact that this was just a morning now, a regular morning, one of the mornings she lived here. She had stopped waiting for it to be taken away. That had happened somewhere in the winter, without announcement. One day she'd woken up and the waiting for the catch feeling had been smaller, and then smaller again. And now, on this April morning, it was not there. In its place was just the morning, the garden, the sound of her daughter naming things, and her son drawing them, and her stepdaughter planning them with the precision of someone who intended to be doing this for years. The word daughter was new and took some getting used to, but it was accurate. They had not asked her to use it. She had arrived at it on her own, the way you arrived at things that were true. Not all at once, but gradually, until one day you looked and the distance between where you were and where you needed to be had closed without you noticing the closing. Gideon came down from the porch with his coffee and stood next to her and looked at the garden. "You're going to ruin your good apron," he said. "I know." "You came out in the wrong boots again." "I know that too." He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "The north section needs attention before the summer," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. "The north section was repaired in March. The east junction of it, the post." He looked at the east pasture. "It'll hold until—" "Gideon." "Fine," he said. "I'll look at it this week." "Thank you." He drank his coffee. She went back to the soil. Around them the children moved through the morning, doing what children did, making noise and making messes and making things, drawing things and naming things, and planning things with the seriousness of people who believed the future was worth making plans for. Which it was. That was the thing Clara had been learning, slowly and imperfectly, for the past year and a half, that the future was worth planning for, that the ground under your feet could be solid ground, that sometimes you had to go a very long way from where you started and arrive somewhere you didn't expect and stay longer than felt safe, before you found the people who saw you plainly and chose you anyway. She had been 31 years old and $42 and a split-soled shoe and a shattered sense of herself, and she had gotten on a stagecoach to a place she'd never been, to take care of children she'd never met for a man she knew nothing about. She had been, it turned out, exactly where she needed to go. The garden was green at the edges already, the earliest things coming up. The mountains sat in their permanent way, enormous and present, the way they'd been the first morning she'd looked at them from the narrow bedroom window. Clara put her hands in the soil and felt it, cold and real. She was here. She was home. She had been chosen, not by accident, not by luck or pity or default, by 5 people who had looked at her, all of her, the plain face and the capable hands and the too direct speech and the history that wasn't clean, and had decided, yes, her, this one. That was the whole story. That was everything.